After receiving crucial information, the Metropolitan Police immediately got in touch with local law enforcement in Hertfordshire. What started as a lead quickly escalated into a full-scale operation. It was already deep into the night when the officers set out. Driving along empty country roads dimly lit by scattered street lamps, they followed their orders with quiet determination. Eventually, the path led them to a nearby nature reserve, a wooded area known to locals as Oxey Woods. The parking lot was empty, cloaked in silence and shadows. Taking no chances, one officer decided against using the route informer had mentioned. Instead, he opted for a less obvious path, worried the original trail might have been staged or tampered with. And then, in the early hours of the morning, precisely at 3 a.m., the operation came to a tragic end. The search was over. They had found Kate. Hey friends, liking, commenting, and subscribing only takes a few seconds, but it means so much to us. Every click and comment fuels our passion. Thanks. Kate Beagley was born in 1974 in the United Kingdom, a place she would come to cherish deeply throughout her life. Raised in a nurturing, stable household, Kate's early years were filled with warmth, support, and guidance. From an early age, she stood out for her maturity, quiet confidence, and natural inclination to care for others. She was the kind of child who always finished her homework, looked out for younger kids, and offered a helping hand without being asked. Her family encouraged education, integrity, and kindness, values Kate carried with her throughout her life. Teachers described her as attentive and ambitious, and friends often relied on her for comfort and advice. She wasn't someone who craved attention, but rather someone who earned respect through consistent actions. After completing high school with solid academic results, Kate went on to earn a university degree, a milestone that brought pride not only to her, but to her entire family. She was drawn to the corporate world, particularly the energy sector, where she built a strong and upwardly mobile career. In time, she became a manager, one of Britain's major energy companies, where her professionalism and strong work ethic quickly earned her a reputation for excellence. Her position as a national compliance manager reflected not only her intelligence, but also her ability to lead, problem solve, and maintain high standards. Kate's colleagues admired her blend of professionalism and empathy. She treated those around her with consistent respect, and many described her as the kind of person who inspired confidence in others. She was organized, articulate, and had a calming presence in even the most stressful situations. She lived in the scenic town of Walton-on-Thames, a tranquil suburb known for its leafy streets and riverside charm. It was here that she cultivated a balanced lifestyle. Kate was physically active, often going for runs or taking yoga classes. She prioritized health and wellness, and her love of nature and travel gave her life a sense of purpose beyond work. Friends recalled how she loved to explore new countries, try different cuisines, and learn about other cultures. Yet despite her adventurous side, she was also known to be cautious, especially when it came to meeting new people. Kate preferred to take her time building trust and avoided rushed or unplanned interactions. But on May 31, 2007, something deeply troubling occurred. Something that shook everyone who knew her. Kate, then 32 years old, did not show up for work. This was immediately unusual. Kate was punctual and responsible, the kind of person who would never miss work without notifying someone. Her father, growing increasingly concerned, recalled that she had gone out the evening before. Unable to reach her by phone, he decided to check on her in person. When he arrived at her home, it was quiet. There was no answer at the door, and the house appeared undisturbed. But Kate was nowhere to be found. To make matters worse, she had also missed a personal appointment, something entirely out of character. Her father, sensing something was very wrong, didn't wait any longer. He contacted the authorities and reported her as a missing person. Within hours, Kate's family and friends mobilized. They weren't content to wait passively. They organized search efforts, created and distributed missing persons posters, and alerted anyone who might have information. Facebook, though still relatively new in 2007, became a central hub for updates and sharing tips. Friends created a group to circulate information and raise awareness. Every detail mattered. Kate's disappearance sent shockwaves through her social and professional circles. People described her as loyal, kind-hearted, and always smiling. Her optimistic attitude and genuine concern for others made her beloved in every corner of her life. Her success at a company like Centrica was no accident. She had worked tirelessly to get where she was, never cutting corners, never taking people for granted. And this made the situation even more alarming. This wasn't someone who would simply vanish or make impulsive decisions. She was someone who planned ahead and communicated clearly. Then, something happened that intensified everyone's concern. A few of Kate's close friends began receiving text messages from her phone. At first glance, this might have seemed like a good sign, but the relief was short-lived. The tone of the messages felt off, stiff, awkward, unlike the natural, warm language Kate normally used. Friends who had known her for years immediately picked up on this. Everyone has a unique texting style. Certain phrases, shorthand, emojis, or quirks in how they type. These messages lacked Kate's distinctive tone and used expressions that didn't match her personality at all. This unsettling development prompted a more detailed investigation. Authorities soon conducted a search of Kate's home and discovered a second mobile phone, one that hadn't been used to send those odd messages. Officers from the Missing Persons Unit began to examine it carefully. Among the numbers in her call history, one stood out. A man named Carl, who she had recently gone on a date with. None of her close friends knew much about him. He was relatively new in her life, having met her just a few weeks earlier at a nightclub in central London. They had arranged to meet on the evening before her disappearance, an important detail. The man's name was Carl Taylor, and the police knew they needed to speak with him immediately. They learned he lived in a modest one-bedroom flat in Covent Garden and had done so for nearly a decade. A background check revealed a criminal record. Not severe, but worth noting. In 2002, he had been convicted of obtaining property by deception. His mother, it turned out, had once urged him to seek help, and mental health professionals had spoken to him over the phone. With the clock ticking, investigators reached out to Carl Taylor directly. To their surprise, he picked up the phone. During their conversation, he confirmed that he had, in fact, met up with Kate the night before. According to him, after their meeting, she dropped him off at Twickenham, where he caught a bus home. He claimed he hadn't seen or heard from her since. However, something about his story didn't quite add up. When officers spoke with Carl's mother, her recollection raised red flags. She mentioned that in the early hours of May 31, Carl had arrived home in a car she didn't recognize. A Volkswagen Golf. He seemed preoccupied and had been seen cleaning the vehicle meticulously. The timing and behavior struck her as strange, but she hadn't connected it to anything specific at the time. Now that detail became a potential clue. When police initially contacted Carl Taylor about the disappearance of Kate Beagley, his explanation raised more questions than it answered. He claimed that the Volkswagen Golf he was driving, Kate's car, had been loaned to him by a woman who needed it cleaned so she could take her children to school. At first glance, this might seem like a favor between acquaintances, but the story immediately fell apart under even the slightest scrutiny. This wasn't just any woman. This was Kate, who at the time had already been reported missing. If she had indeed dropped him off in Twickenham and simply gone her own way, why would he be in possession of her vehicle the following morning? More troubling still, why hadn't he come forward with this information when police contacted him earlier, clearly concerned about her whereabouts? If there had been an innocent explanation, most people would have been eager to assist, not evasive or selective with details. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the car wasn't the only item of Kate's in Carl Taylor's possession. Detectives uncovered that early that same morning, just before 6 a.m., he had handed his mother a stack of shopping vouchers. This was not a typical gesture for him, and the suddenness of it raised eyebrows. Upon further examination, it was discovered that the vouchers weren't his to give. They had been taken from the glove box of Kate's car. Even more alarmingly, investigators learned that Carl had also sold a mobile phone to a friend, a phone that turned out to belong to Kate. He was reportedly pleased about his new car and was openly talking about it in the hours following her disappearance, showing no outward sign that anything was wrong. These inconsistencies and careless actions stood in stark contrast to the serious situation unfolding around him. Further inquiries brought to light that Kate's car had been captured on surveillance cameras just before midnight on May 30, crossing Chiswick Bridge in a direction completely opposite to where Kate lived. The driving behavior was erratic, enough to catch the attention of a police officer who witnessed the scene firsthand. That officer logged a check through the national system, a move that later became a critical timestamp in the investigation. With every passing hour and every new detail, the situation was growing increasingly dire. Carl Taylor was 27 years old at the time. Known to have trained in martial arts and having worked as a football coach and a personal fitness instructor. On paper, he appeared fit, confident, and socially active. But as the investigation closed in, a different picture was beginning to emerge. One marked by evasive behavior and actions that simply didn't align with someone who had nothing to hide. Authorities determined it was time to bring him in for a formal conversation. If this truly was a misunderstanding, as he seemed to suggest, then an in-person interview would allow him to explain himself fully and help move the investigation forward. However, when officers attempted to reach him again, the man who had so readily picked up his phone earlier that day had now gone completely silent. It's worth noting that police calls often appear as withheld or no caller ID, a fact not lost on those who wish to avoid them. Officers, suspecting Carl may have been screening calls, decided to take a more informal approach, using a personal number. This tactic worked. Carl picked up, but once again offered only the bare minimum of information. His story hadn't changed, and yet it still didn't hold up. The officers informed him that two of them would be coming up to London to take a formal statement. Given the concerning gaps in his account and the possessions of Kate's that had turned up in his hands, phone conversations were no longer sufficient. Surprisingly, Carl didn't object. But his response was unusual. Instead of offering to meet at a police station or in a neutral location, he suggested they meet him at a party he planned to attend that evening at a flat in Holland Park. For detectives working a missing persons case, this was a peculiar development. A woman he had recently gone out with had vanished under worrying circumstances, and rather than express concern, Carl was headed to a social event. His attitude didn't reflect the seriousness of the situation. The officers met him at the party, pulling him aside into a quieter room for a conversation. But even face-to-face, Carl remained distant. His responses were vague, his timeline shaky, and his demeanor noticeably closed off. As the party began to fill up, the atmosphere became less conducive to a police inquiry. Music grew louder. People laughed and mingled. Alcohol was being passed around. This wasn't just inconvenient. It was deeply inappropriate under the circumstances. Carl's behavior shifted again. He grew increasingly irritated, his body language more tense. The officers began to feel uneasy. Given his martial arts background and the unpredictability of the setting, the decision was made to remove him from the flat in a controlled and discreet manner. Backup was called in from the Metropolitan Police to assist if needed. To avoid raising suspicion, the lead detective created a casual pretext to get Carl to step outside to their vehicle. Unaware of what was unfolding, Carl complied. Once he was seated in the car, the officers calmly informed him that he was being placed under arrest on suspicion of kidnapping Kate Beagley. He was transported to Walton-on-Thames and held in custody. The gravity of the case now required escalation. It was passed to the Major Crime Unit, and Detective Chief Inspector Mark Preston was appointed to lead the investigation. The focus shifted toward gathering as much information as possible while there was still a chance of locating Kate. But even in custody, Carl Taylor remained firm in his silence. He repeated the same story as before, showing no signs of offering new information. With each passing hour and still no trace of Kate, police faced a difficult decision. There was enough circumstantial evidence, inconsistencies, possession of her belongings, and behavioral red flags to suggest that something more serious had occurred. Carl Taylor was formally rearrested, this time on suspicion of murder. It was a weighty charge, one not made lightly. Investigators hoped this would prompt a response, perhaps even a confession, or a lead to Kate's location. But during the subsequent interview, Carl chose to remain entirely silent. His only response to every question asked was, no comment, no elaboration, no denial, no explanations. In an effort to gain more time, police successfully applied for a court order extending his detention. This would allow them to continue questioning him and pursue additional investigative leads. Yet Carl's approach didn't change. Through each interview session, his stance remained the same, an unwavering, uncooperative silence. As hope began to dim and the pressure increased, investigators pushed forward. There were still pieces missing in this puzzle, but they were now certain of one thing. The story Carl Taylor had told wasn't just incomplete. It was a cover. In the critical hours following his arrest, Carl Taylor continued to withhold information that could help bring clarity to the growing investigation. Despite being presented with multiple inconsistencies in his story and confronted with the troubling reality that he had been captured on CCTV footage topping up fuel in Kate Beagley's Volkswagen Golf, he gave no explanation for his actions. When questioned directly about the footage and the car, he offered no clarification whatsoever. What made the situation even stranger was a detail that left officers puzzled. He had only added 1 pound worth of petrol to the vehicle. It was an amount so insignificant that it made no logical sense, unless it had been an attempt to avoid detection by keeping the transaction brief. This, combined with the fact that he had been driving a missing woman's vehicle and had not informed anyone about it, created a deeply unsettling picture. While the evidence was mostly circumstantial at this stage, it strongly hinted at something far more serious than a misunderstanding. With hope fading for a voluntary breakthrough, officers decided it was time to let Carl return to his cell and reflect on the seriousness of the situation and the evidence being built around him. The strategy was simple. Let the weight of reality set in. That Sunday night, after hours of stonewalling and silence, Carl was permitted a phone call to his mother. A standard right, but one that often offers emotional insight for investigators monitoring behavior. After that call, the decision was made to conduct another formal interview with him, this time in hopes that the mounting pressure might finally bring out the truth. Meanwhile, Detective Chief Inspector Mark Preston, who had been tirelessly leading the case, had now been awake for over 24 consecutive hours. Exhausted and emotionally worn from the intensity of the investigation, he returned home to try and rest, but he barely had time to close his eyes before his phone rang. It was the station. Carl Taylor had just made a confession. In a shocking and emotionless admission, Carl acknowledged responsibility for Kate Beagley's death. When asked why, his answer was blunt and chilling in its simplicity. He had wanted her car. That was the motive. That was the reason. A single material desire had ended the life of someone so cherished by all who knew her. Carl revealed that Kate was in the Watford area of Hertfordshire. Upon receiving this information, the Metropolitan Police contacted local officers in Hertfordshire to coordinate what would now become a major operation. Every step had to be carefully planned. Carl was still in custody, and transporting him required not only high-level security but also constant filming and recording, both for legal transparency and to preserve every piece of evidence that might arise along the way. It was well into the night when the journey began. Officers, driving through quiet roads under dim streetlights, followed Carl's instructions as he navigated them toward the location. There was still a possibility this could be a false lead, another misdirection. But they had no choice but to follow it through. Eventually, Carl led them to a local nature reserve, a woodland area known as Oxey Woods. The car park was deserted, shrouded in silence and darkness, the kind of setting that made even seasoned officers uneasy. Carl stepped out and began directing them into the trees. Out of an abundance of caution, an officer decided to take a non-obvious path, avoiding the most direct trail Carl had indicated, in case it had been manipulated or concealed in some way. And then, in the early hours of the morning, at 3 a.m., the investigation reached a heartbreaking conclusion. The search was over. The site was immediately secured. Floodlights were brought in, the area was cordoned off, and crime scene specialists began the meticulous process of collecting every possible trace of evidence. Forensic investigators worked in silence, their movements careful and deliberate. Later that morning, a statement from Kate's family was released to the public. It was a message filled with love, pain, and remembrance. Her parents and her brother, Guy, spoke of Kate as a loving, thoughtful, dependable, loyal, and tremendously popular daughter, sister, granddaughter, godmother, and friend, who was devoted to her family and friends. They said that she would be missed by everyone who knew her, every day and in every way. The response from the community was overwhelming. Flowers were left at the entrance of Oxey Woods. Strangers, moved by the story and its outcome, came to pay their respects. One card left behind read, "I never met you, but I feel like I have known you for a lifetime. My heart goes out to all those who were blessed with your love and friendship. The world is a sorer place without you." Despite exhaustive efforts at the scene, few personal items were recovered. Kate had to be formally identified through DNA testing. No murder weapon was found, and extensive fingertip searches yielded no additional belongings. Later, Carl revealed that after leaving the scene, he had thrown the evidence out of the car window while driving on the motorway. He also admitted to using some of the bottled water Kate kept in her car, casually, as if none of what had happened bore emotional or moral weight. Detectives now turned their attention to locating Kate's vehicle, which they believed could still contain critical evidence. Carl eventually disclosed its location, saying he had abandoned it on a housing estate in North London. When officers arrived, the car was exactly where he had said it would be. For Kate's loved ones, the days following were a blur of grief, disbelief, and unanswered questions. It was hard to reconcile the calm, everyday routine that Kate had lived with the violent end she had met. The entire ordeal felt surreal, especially given how sudden and unfathomable it was. Her family and friends struggled to find peace while still trying to understand what had really happened that night. Now, having offered his confession, Carl agreed to revisit the pub in Richmond Hill where he and Kate had gone for their first and only date. Across the road from the establishment was an embankment that overlooked the River Thames, a scenic spot with benches and a view. Investigators hoped that walking through the evening's events might unlock more details, pieces of the puzzle that could help them build the clearest picture possible of the timeline and motive. Eventually, with the full body of evidence before them, the confession, the location of Kate's, the recovered car, and other circumstantial connections, the Crown Prosecution Service approved a formal charge of murder against Carl Taylor. But in a stunning twist, despite having confessed, Carl pleaded not guilty in court. He now claimed that what had occurred had been in self-defense. This late pivot added a new layer of complexity to the case. Prosecutors were determined to ensure justice would be served, and to strengthen their case further, police investigators returned once more to the Oxey Woods Nature Reserve, determined to ensure that no stone had been left unturned, and that no potential clue, no matter how small, would be missed. In the weeks following his arrest and confession, Carl Taylor's behavior while on remand revealed a darker side of his personality, one that was not only troubling but deeply manipulative. It would later be reported that during his time behind bars, Carl had befriended two of the UK's most notorious offenders, Levi Belfield and Mark Dixie. Though this fact wasn't public knowledge at the time, it would come to light that Carl had grown surprisingly close to both men while in custody at Belmarsh Prison, one of the country's highest security facilities. According to Laura Richards, a respected criminal behavioral analyst and former head of the Homicide Prevention Unit at Scotland Yard, these three men did more than just share a prison wing. They shared strategies. She revealed that Belfield and Dixie had developed an odd, almost conspiratorial rapport after being housed in adjacent cells, which allowed them to communicate regularly. Over time, Carl Taylor was absorbed into this dangerous dynamic, and together, the trio allegedly coached one another in how to manipulate their upcoming court proceedings. Their goal? To confuse, deflect, and play the system. It was a chilling glimpse into how calculated some individuals can be, even after confessing to crimes that devastated countless lives. Within weeks, all three would face trial at the historic Old Bailey Courthouse in London, a venue that has hosted some of the most significant and high-profile trials in British legal history. And now, it was Carl Taylor's turn to stand before a jury and be judged not just for his actions, but for the lies and manipulation that followed. The courtroom was filled to capacity. The public gallery overflowed with journalists, friends of the victim, and members of the public eager to see justice delivered. Despite his earlier confession, Carl entered a plea of not guilty, surprising many. His defense now hinged on the claim that he had acted in self-defense, contradicting everything he had previously admitted. The prosecution opened their case by reminding the jury that Carl had confessed to the killing. Unprompted, uncoerced, and in explicit terms. The evidence, they argued, did not support any notion of self-defense. It was clear-cut, deliberate, and senseless. The jury was then walked through the timeline. Carl and Kate had first met on the 18th of May at a nightclub in Piccadilly, central London. After exchanging numbers and chatting, they agreed to go on a more formal date 2 weeks later. They chose a well-known pub on Richmond Hill, an area popular for its scenic views and quiet charm. However, witnesses at the pub described an encounter that felt strained and one-sided. According to one bystander who spoke to police, as soon as the couple sat down, Kate was preoccupied with her phone, her head lowered, actively texting. The witness noted that Carl appeared to be doing all the talking, while Kate offered minimal engagement. She remained on her phone when they left. A detail that, while subtle, added emotional weight to the prosecution's argument, that Carl had felt rejected and had reacted to that perceived rejection in a devastating way. After leaving the pub, they walked to an embankment near the River Thames, a peaceful spot with benches that overlooked the water. What happened next would become the heart of the trial. Carl chose to testify in his own defense, a move that often carries risks. On the stand, he referred to Kate as a kind and nice woman, claiming she had seemed troubled. He insisted that he had done everything possible to help her and that he had not meant for anything tragic to occur. But this statement clashed with his earlier confession and with the forensic findings. In a dramatic courtroom moment, a member of the prosecution rolled up a piece of paper. They handed it to Carl and asked him to demonstrate in front of the judge and jury how the so-called act of self-defense had occurred. Carl refused. The presiding judge, Justice Jars Forrester, reminded him firmly that he was not in control of the courtroom and was expected to comply with the process. Still, Carl declined. "I didn't know what to do," Carl told the court. "I just stood there in awe. I was crying profusely. I lay on the grass and looked at the sky." His words stood in stark contrast to CCTV footage that later showed him at a petrol station shortly after the incident, casually purchasing just 1 pound of petrol, behavior that felt oddly detached from the emotional breakdown he described. As the trial progressed, another revelation emerged. Carl had written a letter from his cell at Staines police station addressed to Kate's family. The letter, intercepted by detectives, was never delivered, out of concern for the family's emotional well-being. In the letter, Carl wrote, "My name is Carl. I am the guy that met your daughter on Friday night. To be honest, my first impression of her was that she is a kind but unhappy girl to some respect. Anyway, for the short time I met your daughter, I began to see she was an angel, but in the dark. Even though Katie is not with us, she still shines brightly as a star in the night sky. We live in a world where life is hard for all, and those who try and embrace the good nature get rejected. Without any doubt, what I did was wrong. I don't expect, by writing you this, that I will soften your pain. But as birds sing and flowers grow in spring, remember Katie, and let the love you have and always had for her, and always will, be like the drum beats in your heart." The contents of the letter were reflective, even poetic, but ultimately rang hollow in the eyes of law enforcement. It read more like an attempt to shift the narrative than a genuine expression of remorse. After a multi-day trial, filled with testimony, evidence review, and hours of emotional tension, the jury retired to deliberate. In under 2 hours, they returned with a verdict: guilty. The courtroom reacted immediately. From the public gallery came audible sighs of relief, quiet cheers, and tears from those who had waited anxiously for justice. Carl Taylor was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 30 years before he would even be considered eligible for release. In delivering the sentence, Judge Forrester addressed Carl directly, stating, "I am satisfied that this was a murder. She was doing no more than looking to you for friendship." As the judge delivered the final words of sentencing, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. There was a sense of gravity, a shared understanding that this case had shaken everyone who followed it, from investigators and court staff to members of the public and Kate's grieving family. During the sentencing, Judge Forrester did not hold back. He addressed Carl Taylor with a piercing clarity, condemning his actions and the devastating consequences they had caused. At one point, as the judge laid out his conclusions in solemn detail, Carl interrupted. He spoke quickly, trying to interject. I didn't, Your Honor. Attempting once more to cast doubt, to rewrite a version of events that had already been sealed by evidence, testimony, and a unanimous jury. But the court had heard enough. The interruption did nothing to change the outcome. The judge pressed on with his assessment, unwavering. The verdict, life imprisonment with a minimum of 30 years, brought a degree of closure to the legal chapter of this tragedy, but it could not undo the deep and lasting sorrow it had left behind. The pain of losing someone so full of promise, so deeply loved, was something that would live on in every moment for those who knew Kate. Today, the place has become a quiet memorial. Flowers now mark the spot, placed with care by friends, strangers, and those who continue to carry her memory with them. Tucked among the bouquets are handwritten notes, simple but poignant. One message read, "We miss you, Kate, and wish you were still this side of the rainbow." That sentiment, one of love and longing, speaks for many who followed the case, who watched in disbelief as the story unfolded, and who mourned a life. In the moments following the conclusion of the trial, Kate's father, Alan Beagley, stood outside the courthouse to speak to gathered reporters. His voice was steady, but his grief was undeniable. "I speak for all of us," he said, "when I say that our lives will never be the same again. Our family has been devastated, and life now seems empty and meaningless without Kate. There is a void that nothing will ever fill." His words captured the unspeakable pain of parents who had lost their only daughter. Not to illness, not to accident, but to the deliberate actions of someone who had entered her life under the pretense of friendship and then destroyed it without cause. In the aftermath of the conviction, several members of law enforcement were formally recognized for their commitment and determination. 7 detectives from Surrey Police, along with a dedicated analyst from the Metropolitan Police, received commendations for their part in unraveling a complex and emotionally charged case. Their efforts had spanned weeks of interviews, cross-force coordination, forensic examinations, and moment-by-moment analysis of surveillance and digital evidence.